Um, so Roland, as I was just saying, so we're going to be looking at sort of two questions today, and I was very interested, when we were talking earlier on this week about these two questions that I suppose are going to shadow the Bordeaux theme. Specifically, why is Bordeaux the most famous wine in the world, and why are and subsequently why are many of the South African wines Bordeaux style. So I think that's very interesting, and I think we're going to learn a lot today. Definitely, all of these things that we, I suppose, as South African wine consumers really just take for granted. And I think one of the things that really excites me about this process and is to start illuminating some of the complexities in our wine making and our wine producers. I see we've joined by Higgo Jacobs is also joining us. This is so today we're going to be joined by Roland Peens and his truly Higgo Jacobs. These are wine specialists at Strauss Company, and we are going to be talking you through the schedule of the upcoming 19th century modern, post-war and contemporary arts and decorative arts, jewelry and wine. And today we're going to be joined by Roland Peens and Higgo Jacobs, looking at the Bordeaux theme of our wine up for sale, of our fine wine up for sale in Strauss & Co.'s upcoming May sale. So, and just to let you know, ladies and gentlemen, sort of 2 minutes off, just get rid of some of the formalities. We are also going to be running these Zoom talks through for the rest of the week. I see everybody's just at the stroke of 4. Everybody's joining in. So, guys, I'm going to give it just 2 more minutes while everybody joins in, settles down. Normally, I like to get going by 4. But let's just let everybody log in. Everybody's probably finishing work and things. So I'm just going to give it 2 more minutes, and then we can get going. All right, so gentlemen, I think I see us hit on the stroke of 4. So just for the needs of protocol, because we've got quite a bit to cover today. A lot of very exciting material. And so without further ado, I'm going to get going. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to Strauss & Company for the first in our series of talkabouts of our sale. Our upcoming May sale, including 19th century furniture, modern, contemporary and post-war arts, decorative arts, jewelry and fine wine. So we are today joined by Roland Peens and Higgo Jacobs, our wine specialists at Strauss & Company, that are responsible for putting session 1 together. And they're going to be walking us through some of the producers today in session 1. And they're going to be looking at 2 questions. We're going to be looking at why. I think Roland's going to address why Bordeaux is the most famous wine in the world. And 2, we're going to be looking, I suppose, why specifically are so many South African wines made and styled after in the Bordeaux style. So I think, gentlemen, without further ado, that's enough from me. I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to drive around the website and look at some of the lots. And I'd like to
Thanks, Matthew.
Yes.
So very warm welcome, everyone. It's great to talk about Bordeaux on a rainy afternoon here in Stellenbosch, just outside Stellenbosch. And really, we're talking about Bordeaux, and why is Bordeaux the most famous wine in the world? Well, it really all comes down to trade. So I'm going to talk about the trade of Bordeaux, and then Higgo will be talking about Bordeaux in South Africa, and then we'll highlight some of the lots that are coming on the upcoming sale. But we must go back to the beginning, and like many of the fine wine regions of Europe, Bordeaux started with the Romans. 2,000 years ago, they saw that it was a really good place to plant grapes, and they did. And then for 1,000 years, not a lot of Bordeaux trade. It was mostly consumed in and around Bordeaux or in France. It wasn't France back then. But in the 12th century, something really key happened. The Queen of Aquitaine of Bordeaux basically married King Henry II, and it forged a strong relationship between the UK and Bordeaux. And that's really what led to this incredible trade relationship of selling fine wines from Bordeaux to the UK. And number one, it has a river, the Gironde River, which basically connected all these vineyards to the sea. And of course, Bordeaux city is not very far from London. It was a short trip via boat. So really this relationship started off because there was good wines from Southern Europe that was able to service the UK wine market. So that trade really started going in the 13th, 14th, 15th century. And at that time, it was Saint-Emilion, which was the most famous wine. The wines of Chateau Ozone, for instance, have history books going back 500-600 years. And Saint-Emilion wines were the best wines of the time. Another wine like Haut-Brion was also very famous. That's just outside Bordeaux city in Pessac-Léognan, and that's also 500-600 years old. What's interesting is that in the 16th, 17th century, the Dutch became one of the biggest purchasers of Bordeaux. But they like the more bottom end sort of stuff. And in order to keep it high quality, but at a low price, they saw that they actually needed to get the transport system into a better shape. So what they did was quite ingenious. They drained part of the Medoc. And there was a swamp basically there, and they drained it so that they could build roads and canals and get the water away from the roads. So they're able to get the wines from the winery to the market much quicker, and that preserved the quality. And in doing so, they actually increased the size of Bordeaux quite dramatically, and the great wine estates on the left bank all used to be marshland. So rather interestingly, the French always talk about terroir, but it was the Dutch that created quite a lot of the Pauillac gravel and Saint-Estèphe and Margaux terroir, which is quite interesting. Around that time, the most famous wines, Lafite, Latour, those were all being drunk by the kings and queens. The very famous Thomas Jefferson bottles of the 18th century, which have been written about quite extensively. And there's lots of literature on that if you are a history buff and looking to understand how Bordeaux was operating 400 or 500 years ago. But those are the wines that drove the wine trade. And in 1855, essentially Bordeaux was a set market where the best wines were trading at the highest prices, and year after year the best wines kept on coming up to the top. And they were then considered the first growths, Lafite, Mouton, Haut-Brion, and Latour. And the top 55 chateaux on the left bank were all classified in the 1855 classification. And on the right bank, there are various classifications as well, which can be quite confusing. But the key about Bordeaux really is that it's a region for blending. There's Cabernet Sauvignon Blanc, Cabernet Sauvignon on the left bank, which is on the left-hand part of the Gironde River, and Merlot mostly on the right bank, and a bit of Cabernet Franc in between as well. And it basically leads to the ability to look at the weather for the harvest. And if it's raining in September, the Cabernet would do better because the rain would spoil the Merlot. And if it rained in October, the Merlot would possibly do better because the rain in October could spoil the Cabernet. So depending on the weather, the wineries were able to use different proportions of these grapes, and therefore able to make the best possible wine every year. And that's down to blending. So Bordeaux's also got white wines, and they make some really lovely dry whites down south specifically, as well as some very delicious sweet wines as well, which we don't see much of today. And unfortunately, it is a bit of a declining market. No one around the world seems to want to drink sweet wines from Bordeaux or from really anywhere. But the top wines of Bordeaux are still traded, and every year they're sold on the Bordeaux market. Interestingly enough, because of this COVID-19 pandemic, there's no on-premise happening in this year for the 2019 vintage. And it looks like those wines will be sold in bottle, which will be the first time for perhaps decades or even a century that there's no on-premise in the market. Lastly, before I wrap up and give over to Higgo, I must talk a little bit about the market dynamic. Because Bordeaux makes a lot of wine, 100,000 hectares, which is more than the entire South African area, there's a lot of wine that's trading and a lot of fine wine. So a typical chateau on the left bank might make up to 400,000 bottles of wine selling for 50 euros or 100 euros a bottle. And there are very few, if any, other regions in the world that have that quantum of fine wine producers and that huge amount of stock that gets traded all the way around the world. And it's really that that volume of trade and that very high consistent quality, consistent investment into the region, into the wines that have propelled it to become the most famous wine in the world. Things are changing at the moment where consumers are looking for wines that are a little bit more niche, a little bit smaller in production, and Bordeaux doesn't seem to be the flavor of the month at the moment. If you had been investing in Bordeaux, you wouldn't have seen the appreciation in the prices as you have seen in Burgundy or in Champagne or in Italian wines for that matter. But it's still a very, very important investment category in the world of fine wine. And there still are some thrilling wines, and it seems like every vintage there are more and more fine wines coming out of Bordeaux. Higgo, did I miss anything?
But we'll get back to that, Roland. Thanks very much for that. Matthew, thanks for hosting us, and thanks to Strauss Co for this great initiative. If you'll allow me, just before I dive into the South African context of Bordeaux varietals, just to take a step back, the context of our sales this year, of the Strauss Co fine wine sales. We launched this initiative last year. We had 3 sales last year, and we decided this year, because we were still sort of feeling it out last year and getting the concept right, and we've changed the concept this year to theme all of our auctions. So every sale that we're hosting is in conjunction with Strauss Art and other categories. And we will always have a wine theme. So we've done Burgundy. We've had a very successful Rhone sale last week. The most action that we've had and the highest bidding results, I think 97%, that we've had with any of our sales so far. So it's gaining traction, and we will, at least for the rest of this year and probably for the foreseeable future, we'll stay with this format of keeping them in themes, because I think that just shows our level of seriousness that we take South African wines. And then secondly, I think it's much easier for the buyers and for the audience when it's organized nicely like that, and it's smaller sales, so there's more competition on the bidding. I'll go on to Bordeaux. There's a lot of information in my head, but interestingly, this is not a common narrative in South Africa. The history of South African wine is a common narrative, but the history of Bordeaux in South Africa is not very well documented at all. And I've given that some thoughts, and I think probably the biggest reason for it is it's very significant now, but in our history, it's not really that significant until at least maybe the 1970s or so. If we break it down and we look at the varieties, then really the oldest Bordeaux variety in South Africa is Semillon, that used to be known as Groendrijf. And this is here for as long as wine grapes have been in the Cape. It's been documented that Semillon, along with like Chenin and so forth, were some of the first varieties recorded in the Cape. So that's a history that then goes back 350 plus years. But if we look at the important, I mean, I'm not saying Semillon is not important, but really with regards to the commercial gravitas that Roland was referring to now, we have to really start with the reds, don't we? And you have to look at Cabernet Sauvignon primarily. And the history of Cabernet Sauvignon goes back argumentatively maybe around 200 years. But it's really only documented since the 1880s, and that's at Groot Constantia. So those of you that know Groot Constantia as a property would know that it's a government model farm, government-owned model wine farm. And I think they've sort of modeled it mostly on Bordeaux at the time. And they've started planting quite a bit of Cabernet Sauvignon in the late 19th century. But it didn't really take off in the rest of the country because primarily low yields that you get from Cabernet Sauvignon. So at the time, South Africa wasn't a fine wine country. I mean, if we look at our fine wine history, it's mostly been the sweet wines of Constantia of previous centuries. And then of late, the recent decades, we've had a fine wine renaissance. But we weren't selling Cabernet Sauvignon for expensive prices at the turn of the 19th century. So the varieties like Cabernet Sauvignon were outcompeted with higher yielding varieties, very notably something like Cinsault, or we call it Hermitage in South Africa. So even though it was planted in Constantia, it didn't really spread that much. And then the next real notable thing to mention of Cabernet Sauvignon was in 1920, a certain Professor Perold, Abraham Perold, who you would know as the creator of Pinotage, he recommended planting Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, and Cabernet Franc, and specifically for quality, for chasing quality for the producers of the Cape. And I think that might have led to a little bit more happening, but still there weren't really commercial bottlings of it until notably the 1950s is where we start seeing Cabernet Sauvignon as a label, as a varietal name on the label. And
which ones were those? Alto,
Alto and Lanzerac, and Zonnebloem, of course. So the first decade of where it's documented as a commercial enterprise in South Africa was the 1950s, and it's really Zonnebloem, Lanzerac with 1957 was the first Lanzerac, and then Alto 1959. So those were
Higgo arguably weren't 100% Cabernet. They generally had something else in them as well, didn't they?
Exactly. Yeah. So that's that. I was going to get to that. That's you know, until the legislation of wine of origin in South Africa. So if you don't know what that is, take any bottle of wine that you buy off the shelf, turn it around and look at the wording on the back label, and it would say WO or wine of origin. And that is really when controlling varietal expression on labels and where the grapes are bought from, that started being regulated quite firmly, and that's since 1973. Before that, the name Cabernet Sauvignon was quite abused in South Africa to the extent that you could have Cabernet Sauvignon on the label and not have any Cabernet Sauvignon grapes in your wine. And this has been admitted to us by plenty of the guys from the old times. The interesting thing there is it's not necessarily a bad thing because they used to blend it away with Cinsault, and that led to some of our most wonderful ageable wines that we now have today, notably like the old Rustenburgs, Chateau Libertas had a lot of Cinsault and Cabernet. But just quickly, then from the 1950s, if we go to the 1960s, the wines to note there are the 66 and 68 GS wines that was made for or by, that's argumentative again, George Spiess, who, and these wines now, if any of our listeners can have any of them in their cellars, it's a red, very simple, looks like a word created red label. It says GS and it says Cabernet Sauvignon on the label. If you have any of those and they're in good condition, we'll sell it for you on the Strauss platform. They're now very sought after. So, and then of course the labels that I've already mentioned carried on in the 60s. And then very notably in the 1970s, what I said about WO legislation, but the likes of Canoncorp, the likes of Meerlist, and the likes of Rustenburg started coming to the party with Cabernet Sauvignon, and that commercialized the range really quite strongly. And then only really towards 1990 did we see evening out of white and red grape production in South Africa. So we were, in the 20th century, we were definitely mostly known as a white wine producing country. And only towards the 1990s did we see much more red grape varieties being planted. And I think maybe, Matthew, to get back to your question, why do we see quite a lot of Bordeaux varieties in South Africa? It's because of that wave. Then we were joining the rest of the world, and we wanted to be as good as anybody else. And if you want to get the best prices and look for and compete with the best of the world, you're going to plant the best and do the best varieties. So we planted a lot of the 5 Bordeaux red varietals. But if we look at the history of the other red Bordeaux varieties, Merlot is documented as early as 1910 in South Africa, but the first varietal bottling of Merlot was Wiffergau in 1982. And then Cabernet Franc, the first bottling is quite famously Warwick's Cabernet Franc in the mid-1990s, I think. I see Mike Ratcliffe is here. You can correct me if I'm wrong later, but I think it's mid to late 1990s was the first Warwick Cabernet Franc. And then the other 2, Petit Verdun and Malbec, are really not commercially that important for South Africa. So I won't get into those. The only other thing I do want to look at is the blend format. The blends were started by Welgemeent, Billy Hofmeyr at Welgemeent, which is in Paarl in 1979. And then quite shortly after followed suit by the likes of Meerlus, the Meerlus Rubicon. As you know, it's named the Rubicon because of what it signified and what it meant for the whole of the South African wine industry. The Paul Sours followed quite soon afterwards. So in the 1980s, then we started seeing the Bordeaux blends, and that's probably now, if we look at one of the categories, the most important for South African commercial context. That's our most iconic, high-valued, ageable wines are the blends of the Bordeaux. Just worth mentioning here, I think a lot of South African consumers, it might have been misinformation before, think that a Bordeaux blend from South Africa has to be all 5 varieties. You can legitimately make 100% Cabernet Sauvignon in the Medoc in Bordeaux and sell it as a Bordeaux wine. So you don't have to blend the 5 varieties. It can be any single or combination of those varieties. And then just quickly before I hand back to you, Matthew, the history of the whites, I've mentioned earlier Semillon. Semillon was around 90% of all of our plantings at some stage in South Africa's history, but it was really because it's a high yield, disease-resistant variety, and it was mostly used for distillation. But now Semillon has been an important part of the fine wine renaissance or revolution in South Africa because of the great quality we get from old vines. So we have one Semillon on this sale. We'll get to that. And then, of course, Sauvignon Blanc is the other Bordeaux white variety. And Sauvignon Blanc similarly dates back. The history goes back as far as 1880 once again in Groot Constantia. But then it really only commercialized a century later in the 1980s when dry yeast came to South Africa, cold fermentation came to be a factor. So the style of fresh, crisp, pyrazine, so sort of herbaceous Sauvignon Blancs started taking off in the 1980s. And as you know now, it's South Africa's best-selling white variety. So yeah, I think on that note, I'll head back to you.
So, if you don't mind, Matthew, if I can just add on 1 or 2 things there. Higgo, thank you. That was a brilliant summation of the last century. And really, what it shows is that what we're exposed to, we emulate, and I'm sure the same is in the art world as well. And in the 70s and 80s, our winemakers, they traveled to Montpellier, to Geisenheim and UC Davis in America, and those 3 universities were modeled on European winemaking and, of course, Bordeaux style winemaking. So that's what we learned, and that's what we tried to reproduce here in South Africa. And to maybe be a little bit contentious, had we been exposed to other regions maybe more, we wouldn't have such a strong Bordeaux philosophy in South Africa. We might have a more Spanish or Italian or Southern French philosophy, which arguably could have produced better wines. For instance, in the late 70s, Distel started importing barrels at the time, and a lot of the wines from the 80s are very oaky. They've been manipulated by a lot of acidity, by hard tannin, and maybe haven't aged as well as they should have, because we were really trying to make Bordeaux, even though we don't have the exact conditions of Bordeaux. And it's taken, Higgo, I don't know if you agree, but maybe 20, 30 years to get out of that Bordeaux philosophy, out of the textbook style winemaking, and maybe just look rather at the soil and what could be produced and see what wines we can make that are truly South African and not just Bordeaux.
Yeah, it's no doubt a controversial thing to bring up, and it'll be interesting maybe towards the end. We're going to open this platform to get inputs and questions from everybody listening in. But I think what one can undoubtedly say or agree with what you're saying, Roland, is that these Bordeaux varieties don't suit everywhere in South Africa. But what I'd like to add as a qualifier, I think you cannot argue that Stellenbosch now makes, Stellenbosch and perhaps Paul, if you ask any sommelier working the floor in any of the best restaurants in a first world city, what's the best sites for Cabernet Sauvignon outside of the Medoc, then if they only say three places, Stellenbosch will be one of those 3 places for most of them. So I think we can't ignore, or we can't not include the credibility that we've gained with these varieties from places like Stellenbosch. But then if we look maybe at warmer, drier areas like the Swartland and the Breede Kloof, that would have certainly been handy had they been guided by other varieties that's more drought and heat resistant. I think that's certainly a factor. I think something else one has to keep in mind is we've got the French Huguenot heritage that goes back as far as the 17th century, and that's really also had a big influence on our wine heritage and our wine history. So we were always quite French, even from the first varieties. If we look at the first varieties, Semillon, Chenin Blanc, these varieties were also French varieties.
So I suppose that brings me to why don't we start looking at some of the varieties that we've got, guys. I know we've got a whole whack of lots in the first session. I think we've got Roland, correct me. How many lots do we have?
120. There were 120 Bordeaux lots, Matthew.
120 Bordeaux lots. So I think without any further ado, let's pop over. I'm gonna just quickly show everybody the website and where to find the producers, and then I think that's a great place for us to take off. And so we can start looking by the lots by producer, I think, because that will give us an accurate sort of overview of some of the themes that you both brought up today. And then you can, I suppose, start looking back at the framework that we've got with accurate examples. So let me just I'm going to pop over here. And I'm just going to show everybody, ladies and gentlemen, this is our website. And I just want to show you how to find the wine producers. So you can go browse the auction, which is the upcoming, our forthcoming sale. And the lots are in session 1. But as we were saying, the more useful way to, I suppose, understand the sale that Roland and Higgo are going to speak us through now is looking at it via producer. So this will take us to this window here. And so, guys, do you guys want to give it a whirl, and then I'll do the driving for you.
Great, yeah. Higgo and I will comment on all of these producers. One thing we didn't mention, Higgo, is really why Bordeaux has become so famous as well is because the wines age incredibly well. Let's be honest. We've all had very old wines. I've been lucky enough to have some 19th century Bordeaux wines, which are still in incredible condition, more than 100 years down the line, red wines and sweet and white wines. And Cabernet Sauvignon, especially, but Merlot too, can age for a very long time. It's a small berry and it produces a lot of tannin. And if you get it right, it can be a mind-blowing wine with time. And Bordeaux has that. And we've seen that with South African Cabernet as well. Higgo's mentioning the GS66. That wine is nowhere near from falling over and could potentially last for another 50 years. And that just shows you what Cabernet can do. So the first one on the list is the Alter Ego de Parma. And a real common theme in Bordeaux over the last decade is that second wines from properties are becoming more and more attractive to the consumer. You can imagine a wine like Chateau Parma now goes for about 7,000 Rand a bottle in the market. And not everyone, of course, can afford a Chateau Parma, but we love the taste. And so they produce a second wine, which is a lot less expensive and gives you an idea of what Parma is about. So similar grapes, sometimes younger vines, sometimes a vineyard that doesn't quite make it into the top wine, but will be a very high quality, very close to the quality of the ground vine of Chateau Parma, but a fraction of the price, and generally can be drunk a little bit earlier. And we see this in South African wines, of course, too, where there's a second wine, sometimes a third, sometimes a fourth. And if you go to the top wines like Chateau Latour, they've got 5 levels of separating the quality. And what this has done effectively is reduce the supply of the top end wine in the market and increase the price. So, 50 years ago, you might have had 30,000 cases from a Grand Cru producer, and now it might only be 8,000 cases that's on the market. Parma, very, very famous property in Bordeaux, the most famous outside Chateau Margaux. It's really renowned for its really silky power and meatiness, and certainly is, from a 2015, an attractive buy. This wine is not very far off from Chateau Parma and is going to last for another 30, 40 years quite easily.
I mean, just out of interest, Roland, when you were talking last week about, how we aiming for, around that 1,200, 1,300 cost per bottle of wine. I mean, this comes into, where our fine wines are going in terms of a market point of view, isn't it?
Yeah, certainly. It's, we're not aiming for a specific price, but certainly fine wine is expensive to produce. It's not cheap to make fine wine. It's a huge, long-term process. And yes, this is where there is value in Bordeaux for sure. So for 1,500 Rand to get this wine, you're getting very close to the top end of Bordeaux and for a fraction of the price of the first growth of the top wines, and can be comparable to a South African wine as well.
No, that's very interesting. Right. The next slot we've got is the ever loved Alto. Now my mum has been drinking Alto Rouge for years, but this is a different story altogether. Which lot do you want to start with first?
I'll take them, Roland, if you don't mind. But just before I start talking about the Altos, something that has to be mentioned with regards to fine wine and why their prices are where they are. It's certainly a legitimate exercise, and the key reason for that is not only the ageability, but it's also the scarcity, the rarity factor. You can't make these wines anywhere in the world. You can only make them at certain sites that allow for you to get these complexity and concentration and character. So that means they're finite. There's a limit in supply, and I'm talking Bordeaux, but I'm also talking South Africa. The best wines come from the best places, and you can't just go and copy that in a different site where you're going to get sunshine and water. You need to have the site and the terroir, and therefore there's a limit in the supply, and that's why we've seen what happens to the prices. So Bordeaux remains on top of the investment scale. There's an index called Libex, that's a UK index, and Bordeaux's lost some traction there, but it still remains the top category for investment wines. And I think mostly probably because of those two factors, limited supply, and then the age-worthiness of Bordeaux is just remarkable. And what I want to mention is we shouldn't think that South Africa's wines can't age as well as the Bordeaux blends from Bordeaux can. We have been selling, and we have been tasting and drinking our wines from the 60s. If you look at the good vintages, 1974, 1982, 1984, these vintages, if you can find the good producers from them, they're almost 100% strike rate of being good wines. So our vineyards show that they can age from the right sites, and it's still a fraction of the prices than what you have to pay for similar wines from Bordeaux. So here's a good example of it. Alto, we're selling two lots of, they're both Magnum lots. One is 2000 vintage and the other one 1997. And Alto is actually ridiculous value for money. It's almost a little bit embarrassing because the wines are fantastic, and especially in the large formats, they keep really well in the bigger bottles. If you look at our estimate price ranges there, that's cheap because remember they're 1.5 liters. And I've mentioned Alto's history goes back to 1959. They've consistently made really good Cabernet Sauvignon and Shiraz, and then the Alto Rouge that's even cheaper than the straight cabs. But these are both vintages drinking really well. My personal pick for me would be the 1997. But yeah, two wonderful wines.
Fantastic. Tell me, just from a collectible point of view, what is the difference between a Magnum and your 750? Your 750 is it going to age better in a bigger bottle? Is it what are some of the physics around that, the principle of collecting these kinds of things on
It's not going to fit in your wine rack, that's for sure, Matthew.
Yeah.
So the short answer there, Matthew, in terms of physics, is it's a larger wine to air ratio. So you have less air exposure in a larger format bottle than you would in a small one. So they just age a little bit slower. It's exactly the same wine that goes into the bottle to start with, but we found that with the large formats they just keep better, especially the magnums, because there were lots of them bottled. So if you look at larger formats, it can become a little bit more dicey because it might have been done by hand, but the magnums was legitimate bottlings. So that's really the best, in my experience, the best format to buy if you want to put something down for a long time.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah,
That's helpful. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, Matthew. This is a bit of a legacy item as well, because you might know that Alto's is for sale. Distel are releasing the asset, and us wine lovers, we've always thought, wow, this is an incredible property. You know, it's right next to Rustenfrede. On the one side, you've got Uvemere at the top there, Haskell. It really is one of the great places in the world to make Cabernet, and yet Alto's never really achieved what some of the other neighbors of it have. But going back to these, around this area, Distel was very good at producing very high quality wine consistently. And there were very few other properties that were making magnums at this stage. And every time we open up an Alto wine from the past, Higgo and I are just blown away as to the varietal correctness of the Cabernet and the quality and the freshness. Two of the great vintages I've had is 1965 and 1970. And I was just blown away how fresh those wines were. They tasted like 10-year-old wines, and they were almost 50 years old at the time. So Alto is just incredible terroir, and I think with time we're going to see Alto, whoever buys it, hopefully make it into the superstar first growth that it actually deserves.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I would argue that that Alto hasn't achieved what its neighbors have in the Golden Triangle have on brand, maybe just because it was maybe a little bit lost in the Distel canopy, but it certainly has in terms of quality in the bottle. So just the brand has fallen behind, but the quality in the bottle has always been very good.
So now something a farm I've never heard of before is Botanica. Where are these chaps from?
Well, let me take that one, Higgo. So what we're seeing is a bit of the wine revolution in South Africa, where you don't have to own a chateau or a winery or even a land. You can make wine by buying in grapes from someone and producing it wherever you can find a spot. And this is Ginny Pavel, and she's become a big part of the industry. She came from America and has a little guest house and produces incredible wines. She's found some old parcels from all around, and this is part of her Mary Delaney collection. And old vine Semillon at its best. I think you got to like this texture that Semillon can bring, especially with the old vine examples. It tends to taste very unique. It doesn't have a Bordeaux-esque character, but more of a Cape character. And these Semillons, much like the Buchenholz Kloof and the Arlights and the Thorn and Daughters, can be just incredible drinking experiences.
The Buitenverwachting is a name that a name of producers that has come up quite consistently. Tell us a little bit about the offering of Buitenverwachting that we got on the sale.
Just one note to add to the Botanica, as it was a Platter 5-star, so certainly that's a nice little collector's item. So Buitenverwachting is one of the oldest farms in South Africa, and certainly one of the crowns in the jewel, or one of the jewels in the crown of the Constantia Valley. It's always been striving for quality. And if we look at the Christine, this is a 6-bottle lot of the Christine 2001. It's from a private collector, but it's been kept at Wine Cellar. It's in really good condition, this lot. The Christine is, in my opinion, and probably in most people's opinion, the highest regarded or the most trustworthy of the Constantia Bordeaux Reds. And they age superbly well. And what we find with Constantia, I used to work there as a sommelier for a few years. And with the Constantia Reds, they're very similar to Bordeaux in their makeup, in their character. And when they age, they also have this earthy, leafy, because of the cooler climate in Constantia. So this, you can expect maybe a little bit of an earthy, dusty nuance to this wine, but if you like that style, it's held up beautifully. It's an elegant, cool climate Bordeaux red. Wonderful wine.
Fantastic. So the next one, we've got Cape Point Vineyards. I suppose keeping in that sort of in the southern region. Speak to us a bit about and then also again Constantia Glen, which is also around the corner. But let's stick with Cape Point Vineyards. What do we got on offer here?
Yeah, I'll comment on those. Well, what we've seen really with Sauvignon Blanc is that it requires a cooler climate in order for it to produce a wine of immense complexity and character and ageability. In a warm climate, Sauvignon Blanc ripens very quickly. It gives lots of tropical fruit up front, but it doesn't give you much depth and character for aging. It needs that acidity. And of course, one of the pioneering wines in Sauvignon Blanc, probably the most famous in the last 2 decades, is Cape Point Vineyards, made very famous by Duncan Savage's winemaking technique, and very close to the ocean, these vineyards, and produce very, very classically styled Sauvignon Blanc. And even though it is labeled Sauvignon, it's matured in oak. They've put in a touch of Semillon as well. So it's very, very Bordeaux-like. You can see there Tim Atkins' wine report, how he says that it wouldn't look out of place alongside a top Pissac Léonin, and we're talking about Haut-Briand Blanc, Smith Out Lafite, Domaine de Chevalier, and so on, which are very, very famous wines of Bordeaux. So really, at the office, we always talk about how these wines are remarkably cheap for what you can get, because if you were to buy a Domaine de Chevalier, you'd be spending 2,000 Rand a bottle, whereas a similarly scored wine from Cape Point Vineyards won't cost you more than 300 or 400. And here you can see the estimate for 6 bottles is just 1,000 to 1,500. So long aging and an incredible bargain for the real wine lovers out there.
Constantia Glen, I suppose, is really gone from strength to strength in recent years, and this is an early bottle of theirs. Tell us a little bit about the number 5.
Thanks, Matthew. Yeah, just a little comment before I fire away with Constantia Glen on Cape Point. We'd love to sell more white wines on the Bordeaux sale. In my personal opinion, is we make as good Bordeaux South Africa as we do red. The problem is just, unfortunately, and this is not a South African thing, it's a global thing. The whites don't fetch the same prices, and they don't have the same reverence as the reds do. But we make wonderful white wines in general in South Africa, as you would know, but also specifically white Bordeaux, Sauvignon Blanc, straight Sauvignon Blancs, and those with a little bit of a blend of Semillon in. So these will go probably for a steal, and they can keep for a long time, and they're wonderful wines. Constantia Glen, it dates back to, I think, the turn of the century, to about 2000. And they just, what I like about this producer, they came with a lot of confidence onto the scene. They, from the start, set their price points fairly high. And they said, we've got great terroir, we've got a great site, we have a great winemaker, and we're investing a lot in the cellar and the winery. So we're going to be playing around in the beginning. We're setting our bar high, and they were able to build a great following from the beginning, from the early 2000s. And specifically with this wine, with the Constantia Glen 5, they also do a 3 and a 2, and that refers to their use of Bordeaux varietals. So the 5 uses all 5 of the red Bordeaux varieties. This 2008's cooler climate, and if you know where Constantia Glen is, it's on the crest there just before you go over to Hart Bay. So the site it's an incredible site for making wine. Eagle's Nest is close by there as well. If you go up to their vineyards, you need a 4x4 to go onto the vineyards, and it's great in the sense that it's got the cool climate, proximity to the Atlantic, to False Bay there, but it's also great altitude because you climb quite a bit as you go up that hill. And that combination is wonderful site, wonderful terroir. 2008, as I said, cooler vintage. So this wine is very ageable, very structured. But it's probably quite ready to drink. So that will be a great little find, I think.
Just an interesting point on the Constantia Glen is that also the kind of sunshine that part of the valley gets. I think they get sort of morning and midday sun, and then it's quite dark from quite early on because the sun sort of goes over the valley. So I think their exposure to sunlight also has got a great impact on how their grapes flower and mature.
Sure. Yeah. The slopes is a factor there. Shall we move on to the cars?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So very a famous wine in Bordeaux. It's regarded as one of the great properties of Saint-Estèphe, which is the northern commune in the Medoc, next to Montrose. It's certainly the most famous Saint-Estèphe, and it borders Château Lafite, which is arguably the most famous. So really, really highly prized terroir. It was bought recently, and a lot of money has been injected into it. And the wine is a bit more in the modern style. So if you do like a very, very classic style of Bordeaux, I would probably go for the 2005, which was an incredible vintage for Bordeaux. If you like something a little bit more modern and maybe want to drink something a bit earlier, then the 2014 you can see is a lot less expensive due to the vintage not being rated as highly, but still a very, very good wine. And this for me is a little bit more on the modern side of Bordeaux, quite rich and powerful and plush. And you could probably drink it a little bit earlier. Not that it's going to expire at all. It's going to age for a very long time as well. But the important point here is 2 very rare bottles of 2005. And, these will be just starting to reach their drinking windows now at 15 years. But because it's such a great vintage, it's going to last for forever, 50 years quite comfortably. It's really a very long-term, very high-end Bordeaux.
Fantastic. The de Touraine is now. You must excuse my ignorance, but is this a local producer or is this an international producer?
This is local. It's a Stellenbosch producer. So this was set up by the Den Dulk family. Emile Den Dulk started in the early 1990s. And I think the first vintage might have been 1999. So in the late 90s, they started releasing this Fusion 5. And if I spoke about the audacity and the confidence of Constantia Glen, this takes it to another little level. They really had the confidence from get-go to say, we're going to compete with the best of the New World Bordeaux expressions, and we're going to do the price points at the same place. And we see a lot of that, or not a lot, but we see quite a bit of that in the Cape now. But at the time, that was pioneering stuff, because we were still seeing some of our best Bordeaux blends selling for below 100 Rand in South Africa at the time, and these guys came out and they said no, the wines are worth much more. And they, from the start, especially in the on-trade and restaurants, they started getting a nice little following. We'd like to see more of these wines coming onto auction. We've been speaking with so the ownership has changed. The Den Dulks have been bought out by some European interests, but Albie Koch is still the winemaker there, so the focus on quality and the style is remaining, and their wine signature is remaining because of Albie's presence there. We've had some conversations with them, and I think we'll see a bit more of the Touraine coming onto our auction platforms in the future. So all 3 of these lots are from private collectors. They're not from the producer. This one that you've got on now, the 2010, is a large format. That's a 3 liter, I think. Mm-hmm. 2010, quite a warm vintage, but the big format, as we said earlier, ages a little bit slower. So this one has a lot of concentration and probably still quite a bit of legs in it to go for longer. A personal pick for me would be the 2002. There's a 6-bottle lot of the 2002 vintage. So the other thing that the Touraine did well is they started quite from the get-go to get international traction and international ratings on the wines. And they were some of the first producers to start getting ratings and scores in the 90s, at a time when the wines from the Cape weren't really getting ratings in the 90s. So yeah, 2002, maybe not a standout Cape vintage, but the Fusion 502 is elegant, quite structured and tight, and this is drinking beautifully. So it would be a nice find.
Yeah, this has really been, along with Villafonte, one of the real luxury modern wineries of South Africa. And what we forget sometimes is that how long it takes to create a fine wine brand. This is 20 years in the making. And that's what Bordeaux understands and realizes quite well, that you need to invest in a property for a very long, prolonged period in order to achieve the status that some of these top wineries do achieve. And the turn is on his way there. I think they've still got some potential to get even closer to the pinnacle of fine wine in South Africa. But every wine that they offer is really refined, and the wine's aged remarkably well. As Higgo said, I've been lucky enough to taste all the way back to 1999, and none of them are anywhere near falling over. They're all in fantastic shape.
Fantastic. De Trafford, it's speak to us about the lot that we've got on offer here. It's
okay, quick one. I'll talk about that one, Higgo. I'd lived on De Trafford for a couple of years. It was a fun part of my life. It is the most beautiful tucked away farm in all of Stellenbosch, right at the top of the Lochlippen Valley. And what David Trafford does there is quite magical. Very small volumes of wine. He picks it quite late. He makes quite a plush, rich style, but incredibly, the wines just age with absolute grace. And again, I've tasted most of his wines back to the early 1990s, and again, none of them are falling over. They're all in fantastic condition. He makes wine very naturally, no additives, and just very rich but long-aging classic Cabernet. I think he's one of those producers, year after year, produces just great Cabernet.
Wonderful. Delecraft also again is become, I suppose, arguably one of the household names in South African wine. Speak to us about the offering that we've got of craft. I see all from 2011.
Yeah, so Delecraft has had a little bit of a renaissance or a makeover, as you would know. So it was started famously by John and Erika Platter of the Platter SA Wine Guide in the early 1980s. And then at the time, I mean, Brevard Arts, who would also, I think, has a Cabernet Franc lot on, he was winemaker at Delecraft. So it's always, or at the time, just called Dale Estate. It's always been a quality producer, purely because of where they are. It's a great site just over the road from Tukara. They're on the Botmaskop sort of Helswichte site there as you go over the reach of Simonsburg to Franschhoek side. This is a great site for producing Cabernet Sauvignon and Chardonnay, I would say. And then Lawrence Groff bought it and really made it one of the jewels of the Cape. It always was the news that you get from there, but he's just set up a hotel or restaurant and took it to another level. And from early on, Mornay Frey from Carlersdorp was appointed there as winemaker, and he really rose to the occasion, into the boots there, and started making award-winning wines from early on. This 2011 Cabernet Sauvignon Reserve, so they do a straight Cabernet Sauvignon, and then they do the Cab Reserve, and then they do another level up, which is the Lawrence Groff Reserve. But this is already at a high price point in terms of where they release it at. But year after year, if you look at Cabernet Sauvignon challenges, competitions, Dale just comes up in the blind tastings. They're wonderfully pure, structured, but I think unashamedly still modern and new world. There's a lot of body and extract to the wine, but they're great balance and well poised. And the wines keep for a long time, and I think that's mostly it's winemaking skill, but it's also just because of the great site. And then the Botmaskop is that's their blend, and that's the value for money sort of proposal. The Botmaskop has been going since before Lawrence Groff took over, so that's one of the early labels from Dale, and it's always been a value for money sort of wine, but it's just great value if you look at what's in the bottle. It's a Bordeaux style blend, so Cabernet Sauvignon with other varieties. Yeah, and it's going to be for half the price of the Reserve, but it's almost just as good.
Yeah, and it's a Platter 5-star as well. That wine.
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
It's certainly one of the best bang for buck wines from Stellenbosch. Isn't it amazing, Higgo, to see this interest that has been injected into Stellenbosch and into the Cape, producing one of the great luxury products. Often I see helicopters flying from Cape Town through to the winelands, and more often than not, they're flying to De La Graaf for a lunch or a dinner or a stay over. And it really is one incredible property, and the wines match the art, match the jewelry, match the restaurant. It's just an incredible fine wine brand. And if you talk about Bordeaux, Bordeaux is certainly luxury. A lot of the chateaus are just jewels of luxury, really. I was at Chateau Parvis late last year, and it's just incredible the lavish chateau is, and the cellar. It's just a privilege to be in almost the sanctum of wine such as that.
Yeah, it's wonderful to have had this international investment in South African wine, because they, you know, it's just taken from a wine tourism point of view, it's just taking it to another level. For those of you that haven't been to De La Graaf Estate, it would be one of the most glorious wine addresses in the world to go and visit. It's picturesque, it's a fantasy, and it's great that they didn't just go for, okay, let's make it look beautiful, but we don't care about the wine. One of the first things they started investing in more was in the vineyards. So the wine's right on top, along with the hospitality offering. It's a good address.
Now, Dimmersdal is, has been making that warm sort of chocolatey red that has been, a favorite for
That's Dimmersfontein.
Dimmersfontein, I beg your pardon. I always get it confused. So tell me a little bit about Dimmersdal. Sorry, guys. Tell me a bit about Dimmersdal. What is this? This is a very old. Wine. Has it kept its legs? Is it? What's special about this wine, given its age?
I'll take this one quickly, because often we taste these wines in the office at Wine Cellar, and I see my colleague James has got a note for that one, tasting it in February. And really what must be said about Durbanville is today it's made famous by Sauvignon Blanc, but Cabernet has actually done extremely well, and the GS Cabernet reportedly came from Durbanville Hill grapes. It's a very cool climate, and it's close to the ocean, which makes it very similar to that of Bordeaux. And it's remarkable how some of these old Dimmersdals have aged to a Mirandal to some extent as well. But there isn't a lot of these wines out there, to be very honest. And they sometimes are a bit of a hit and miss, but we were very surprised by just the freshness of this wine. Obviously, it's a mature wine at 35 years, but it is in remarkable condition. And it's great to see the Lowe family really continuing the legacy of Dimmersdal and producing great reds and whites today. And Dimmersdal is certainly the leading property in Durbanville for me in today's market.
Just a question on somebody buying an estate red like that for as you said, a 35-year-old wine. Is this an open now kind of bottle, or is this would you be buying this for your cellar?
No, these are certainly wines to drink now, and a lot of these wines will reach a plateau where you can drink them for 10 or 15 years and they'll be fairly similar in their taste. But if you experience them with food, without food, different occasions, you're going to get a different experience. You can imagine over time now, oxygen has had a big impact on the flavor compounds within the wine, and you start getting a much wider array of flavor compounds, and that's what we get all giddy about in the world of wine geeks. We start picking up all these incredible aromas, cold tea and all kinds of forest floor, and your granny's cupboard, and all of these sorts of things. We love it because you go back to the glass and you're getting something new, and then as the wine sort of oxidizes in the glass, it starts fading. And sometimes a wine like this, if you have too long in the glass, can actually start falling over. So you need to take it for what it is. It's a very old wine from the Cape. And if you can get this for 4,000 Rand, 5,000 Rand, I think it's going to impress a lot of people at future dinner parties.
Fantastic. So we're going to finish the first lot, the first column here, because we've got two more weeks to go.
Matthew, I wonder, should we not maybe look at a few questions?
Yeah,
because we're on on the hour. So if there's then more time, then we can look at a few more lots. But
yeah, sure.
Perhaps
I just wanted to ask, are there any other wines particularly to note? I mean, I know your standard response is yes, Matt, all of them. But is there anything sort of in closing that you want to say before we open up for questions about some of the any important lots that you just want to identify?
Well, I think, Higgo, if you could just touch quickly on those local properties, because I think they are all very important. Ernie Els, Glenelly, they've had incredible investment, and Hartenberg has been a stalwart, and I'm sure Higgo will talk about them. But Domaine de Chevalier, Figeac, and Haut-Brion, all very, very famous and very old wines of Bordeaux that go back literally hundreds of years. Domaine de Chevalier is an organic property from the south, and very classic styled wines. They also make an incredible white wine, which is one of the most famous of Bordeaux. And this consistently gets high Parker ratings, 90s, 92s, 95s. And if you like modern style Bordeaux, this will probably start drinking in the next 3 or 5 years, and then it will plateau for another 20 years. Just one of the great names of Bordeaux. And one thing maybe I can say is that this particular commune or region of Bordeaux, Pessac-Léognan, is a style of wine that's probably the closest to our South African or Stellenbosch Bordeaux style blends. It's got an earthiness, it's got some richness to it, and this, I think a lot of South African palates tend to like this wine. And then moving quickly to the Figeac, this is a Saint-Emilion property which is starting to punch above its weight. Every 10 years they have a reclassification of the wines of Saint-Emilion, and apparently this property, had they got all their affairs in order, they would have been pushed up to first growth in quality, but they were a little bit behind or a bit too lazy with the paperwork. But it certainly is, it's regarded as one of the first growths of Saint-Emilion. It borders Cheval Blanc. It's got some of the similar terroir of Cheval Blanc, but interestingly, it's got more Cabernet than any other wine on the right bank. Very, very fine wine, and this will be now perfectly mature from a classic vintage. 90 points is a very light score for me on this wine. I would probably be a little bit higher than Neil Martin, but very famous wine. It's climbing in price radically at the moment because it's starting to be seen as a first growth rather than a second or third growth like it was in the past. And then finally, of the Bordeaux, just in this first lineup, we must talk about the 89 Haut-Brion, because this wine, second from the bottom there, Matthew.
Yeah, thanks.
This wine is from 1989, and if you read Neil Martin's notes, he calls this one of the greatest wines ever made in Bordeaux, ever. It's 100 points from a lot of the critics. I've been lucky enough to taste it once, maybe twice, and it's just remarkable how young and how solid this wine is. It just is absolutely complete. It's got flavor, it's got structure, it's got power, it's got huge amounts of layers to it. It's just completely composed, and for someone who's got a budget, this wine has gone up quite radically over the last decade in price because now there's very little available in the market. And to get this for 50 is actually a very good investment, either in your drinking or to on-sell it in 10 or 20 years' time. It's going to be worth, who knows, millions.
Amazing, cool. Thanks so much, Roland, for that. That's one for the punters. Higgo, do you want to talk us through the Ernie Els wines quickly? I mean, these are quite, I suppose, for South African wines, priced a little bit higher than what we've been looking at. Why are these? What do you think is special about these wines?
Well, what Ernie Els have been able to do is, drive a very high-profiled brand alongside with really good quality wine. So Louis Strydom makes some quite modern New World style wines there, but they're super ageable as well. Ernie Els are not far from that golden triangle that we mentioned earlier, the sites close to Alta and Rissenfrede. So it's great position on the Helderberg, but they're unashamedly full-bodied, quite bold in their style. And yeah, I think the reason that we go fairly high. Sorry, can you guys hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, the reason they go quite high with price points is, or we've gone fairly high on the estimates, is because of the high release price that they come out of. So they were also quite bold in setting themselves up. There's a lot of investment that's happened in that winery, in the cellar, and they've now actually they're doing another round of refurbishment there now. So they're taking it another step up. So yeah, both of these lots, I realize that the estimate seems quite high, but the wines that will still keep, the 2000 vintage, good vintage for the Cape, for Stellenbosch. And these wines are only really coming into their own now, and you can still keep them for a while. So they would also make out an investment opportunity. Maybe just before to question, because I realize that everybody will not tune in again for our future talks. You asked me to highlight a few of the others. Two that I would mention is the Keat First Verse. That's a 2011 vintage. So if you just go back to the producer's list, there's a 6-pack just second from the top, and second from the top, and there we go. So this wine is made by Chris Keat, who famously put Cordoba on the map with the Cordoba Crescendo. He's probably one of, I wouldn't say but certainly one of the finest hands with Cabernet Franc in the country. And he makes these Cabernet Franc driven red Bordeaux blends. These wines are hen's teeth. They're really hard to come by, and this is straight from the producer. I was able to twist Chris's arm for a little 6-pack of the 2011 vintage. He only started with this after leaving Cordoba around 2009 was the first vintage. So this is a wonderful wine if you can get your hands on that. And then the other lot I would like to highlight is Mbembe Rats. There's a little vertical of the MR de Campostella. So there we go. Yeah, the Campostella 2004 to 2009. This is a vertical lot. It's something that's never been sold in South Africa before. It's also straight from the cellars of Brevet Rats. So Brevet, I mentioned earlier, was winemaker at Dallegraf before, and he set out on his own with Rats Family Vineyards. He makes that great Cabernet Franc in Shannon, and this is a collaboration with Mokazana and Mbembe. But this is certainly one of the most sought after Bordeaux blends coming out of the Cape. And to get a little cross view, I think 2004 might have been the first vintage of it. So to get a little cross section of a vertical from 04 to 09, that's something that makes my mouth water to look at it. It's something that hasn't been sold before. So it's a nice little highlight, that. Should we take some questions, Matthew?
Yeah, absolutely. So ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to stop sharing from here. And then just firstly to say thank you so much for giving us your time. And Roland and Higgo are going to be on the line for, let's say 5 more minutes whilst everybody's here. I know it's coming up to the end of the working day, and so let's hang around. I'll be taking videos taking questions either for Roland and or Higgo, or if you want, if anybody's a bit shy, you're more than welcome to send me a message in the column here. I'm just going to say, hi, please direct questions here. And that'll come up in the chat column. So if anybody wants to pop me a question for Roland and Higgo, please feel very welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, just while I wait for anybody to pop us some questions, I'll just remind you that you've been chatting to Roland Peens and Higgo Jacobs, and we've been talking about some of the fine wine that's going to be on sale in Strauss Co's forthcoming live auction of 19th century modern, contemporary, and post-war decorative art, jewelry, and fine wine. So
Higgo, what do you maybe Matthew, we can discuss a little bit about the modern era of Bordeaux wines. I think if you start a property today, there's not going to be as big a pressure to start a Bordeaux style property rather than maybe a Rhone or a Pinot Noir or something like that. So Higgo, are we losing out on the sort of the new upstarts not producing Bordeaux wines?
Yeah, it's an interesting thought to have. I think what's happening is a positive change, and what that is when a new vineyard gets planted, the owner or the producer would be encouraged, if he doesn't have the inclination to do so himself, or she would be encouraged to look at the site first and foremost in terms of what it's well suited for. Whereas what we saw in decades gone by, the encouragement would have been to plant what's going to give you the best financial results in terms of what gets the best price per litre in terms of when you want to be selling it. So as a real fine wine quality player now, we can't afford to just be mocking around, and one of the first places to start looking is what is the best suited varietal for your place and for your site. And I think what's happening then in the warm, at least in the warmer and drier areas, people simply won't be planting Bordeaux varieties anymore. They're quite fickle, they yield low, they need water, they need moderate temperature. So there, the sort of Mediterranean varietals would be advised better. And I think for the larger image of South African wine, that's a positive thing to happen. But it will certainly make Bordeaux volumes drop, or Bordeaux style volumes drop coming from the Cape. But I think those that are around and that are doing well will remain. And
that's a good call. Yeah, I think I agree with you, Higgo, on that. The top producers, you know, the Villafontes, the Canon Corps, those that are producing the best Bordeaux blends in the country, I think they're going to focus even more and make sure that they are right at the top of that list. I think Bordeaux requires a huge amount of investment year after year in the vineyards, but also in the brand and the marketing in order for it to be at the top of the list. I saw there was a question there from Mike at Villafonte. That is a very good question. I mean, when are we going to have a live auction again? Quite a big question for me, because I've raised my hands to be an auctioneer for one of the live auctions, and I was supposed to be doing the Bordeaux one, which would have been an interesting debut for myself. But the Strauss executives are still deciding as to what the protocol will be. It's very likely that the next few auctions will be online, or at least online-based auctions, which worked remarkably well for the Roland sale, and we'll have to see as we go, as we understand the new rulings and what's available.
I think just on that note, I think actually the executive is in a meeting currently. That's why none of them have joined us today on this matter. I think we are looking to make an announcement in the next day or two on that, just so we can make assurances to everybody. But I can at least tell you that the sale will be going ahead as scheduled, and I think we're going to. I think with the easing of restrictions, potentially, I think we're going to because people do need to see some of these lots. So we're going to be coming to you by Zoom, and I think there's going to be a case for special appointments if people want to view the lots and things like that. So don't get me wrong.
On that, Matthew, the big difference between wine and art and some of the other categories is that wine, you don't always need to see the bottle.
No.
So if there's a Melis Rubicon 2001 and you've seen that the wine is in good shape, and Higgo and I have checked and we're very happy with the quality, you don't always need to see it, and you don't need to be at the auction. So online auctions have been really increasing the visibility of some of the lots, and it might be a case that moving forward, the auction scene in South Africa and around the world might become a lot more digital.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose we really are tracking new territory, and it's a brave new world. So I think we're finding out every day solutions to these things. But yeah, an announcement. The short answer is an announcement will be should be forthcoming in the next a day or two from our executive. But thanks very much, Mike, for asking. Any other question for Roland, Higgo, ladies and gentlemen? Otherwise, I think and we've got one from Mr. Knight. Thank you so much for that, Andrew, and please keep your eye on the sale, and we will be coming to you. Bidding should be open in the next couple of weeks, so that's very exciting.
Andrew, we also aren't wine buffs, and we also just enjoy a nice glass of wine. We probably just have too many.
I see there's a, yeah, there we go.
Higgo's actually only 25 years old. Look at him. No, thank you, Matthew. And look forward to talking next week when we can talk through the rest of the lots. There's so many. We'd like to talk about all of them for hours, but you know, we do make wonderful Bordeaux style wines, which haven't been necessarily appreciated around the world. And until now, Higgo, some of the journalists and critics are starting to view South African Bordeaux blends as being some of the best in the world, but it's taken some time for us to get there.
Yeah. Just quickly, Lufuno's question there, someone that wants to learn more, where we can be contacted. Lufuno, I have a website if you want to get my contact details. It's just my name and surname. You can get a hold of Roland at Wine Cellar, or get in touch with Sarah, who's listening in here now on the Strauss Co, the wine, Strauss Co Wine website, and she'll direct the questions to us. If you are interested and keen to learn more, I can really advise quite a few courses that's running in South Africa. I'm involved with teaching quite a bit of sommelier courses that's running, so we'll happily take questions from you by email.
Fantastic. So guys,
thanks, Matthew.
Super. So I'm going to close off here. I think we on the edge of 1:15. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd just like to remind you that Roland and Higgo will be joining us again next week, 4 o'clock Monday. So same time, same place. And for me, it's a really wonderful experience. I'm incredibly embarrassed that I got Demers Dahl and Demers Fontaine confused. That will never happen again. Sorry, gentlemen, to insult your incredible knowledge and intelligence you brought to us today. But tomorrow, next week, Monday, 4 o'clock, just to remind the audience, you can catch our wine specialists with Strauss Co and Roland Peens and Higgo Jacobs discussing Bordeaux wine. And why is Bordeaux the most, and they'll be seeking to answer, why is Bordeaux the most famous wine in the world, and why is so many of the South African wines Bordeaux style. So again, Roland and Higgo, thanks so much, gentlemen, and I will see you again Monday.
Cheers. Thanks, Matthew.
Cool. Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you so much for joining Strauss Co. Just a reminder of our program tomorrow, just while I've got everybody here. Tomorrow, we will be joined by Sophie Louise Froelich and Wilhelm van Rensburg, and they will be talking about mid-century furniture, the collector's guide, and we're going to be talking about why mid-century furniture has become increasingly regarded and as a modern collectible. So please tune in for that. That's going to be with Sophie Louise Froelich from our Cape Town office and Wilhelm van Rensburg from Johannesburg. So that should be a very nice talk, and I suppose just demonstrating the range of items that we have on Strauss Co. Again, thanks so much for joining us, and have a good evening. Bye-bye.